Hello and welcome to your favorite podcast in the world. It's Stripping the Dipping, and you're joined by your usual dynamic duo of F1BLAG and I, AMG Denz, Denzel Clarkson. And we hope that everyone's keeping safe and enjoying this very fiery hot summer that we have right now in the UK and across the world as well. But I'll kickstart this episode with a really fiery quote from the legendary Graham Hill, who once said, I'm an artist, the track is the canvas, and my car is the brush. And I'm sure our special guests will have taken a very similar view into the insightful and engaging articles and things they've been able to present over the years that they've been engaged. So, without no further delay, we're very happy to give a warm welcome to our special guest, Ed Foster. Ed, how are you keeping at the moment? I know that we were chatting backstage and having the obligatory conversation, as F1BLAG said, about this excruciating hot conditions we have at the moment. But generally speaking, how are you doing at the moment?
Yeah, very good, thanks. Very good. Looking forward to this hour. I'm obviously usually on the other side of the mic, as it were. So actually talking about myself is not something I tend to do much. So I'm intrigued to know where we'll end up. Down too many rabbit warrens, because that's usually where I end up.
Well, we don't mind the rabbit holes either, Ed. And, it's great as well because we have so many different people with a variety of different backgrounds. But it's also great, just to get into the people like you that have a profession, have something which, is quite linked to how we see and digest, motorsport and how we experience it. So before we get into a deep dive, Ed, of just like your history, kind of what you're doing career wise as well, we know that you've worked with Motorsport magazine. You've obviously had a stint as well with the Italian media and the Italian version of Autocar. And then, oh man, like I'm really jealous of your CV, man. Like you've even had this current kind of involvement with the Goodwood Festival of Speed, much loved event that happens, kind of in and around this all what is amazing about motor racing and classic cars, modern day cars as well. But for our listeners at home, could you give them a synopsis as to who the real Ed Foster is and what were your earliest motorsport memories and motor racing memories growing up?
Yeah, so I suppose I'm like a lot of motorsport fans in that my dad was into motor racing, and he used to race himself. And I remember vaguely kind of going to races with him. Um, to kind of help, but I don't think I did any help at all. I basically sort of got snot and ice cream on his car, and sort of lost spanners for him and things like that. But I remember because he used to race his 1948 Simca Gordini, and it was famously fragile, and it didn't have much power. So at someone like Monaco, it was really good. And then I think he won in Copenhagen on a little sort of triangular circuit. But invariably, one lap people wouldn't come round. And actually, he was contacted by a French guy who wanted to buy the car off him. And by that time, he'd sort of done the races he wanted to do. And my brother and I could not fit into it because it's a tiny, tiny little car. And so this Frenchman ended up buying it. And he called him about 3 weeks later. He said, John, I'm at Silverstone. The car's broken. My dad said, well, how many laps have you done? He said, I've done 10 laps, and then that's it. It's broken. And my dad said, well, it's twice as many as I ever managed in that car at that circuit. Yeah, and then we spent a long time at the workshop, kind of, playing with cars and bits and pieces. And I kind of knew I wanted to do something with motorsport. And it just happened that as I finished university, this job in Italy came up through a kind of friend of a friend of a friend. And they were looking for a British person who could learn Italian and work as the kind of British link in the Italian office for Autocar. And the proviso was I had to start writing in Italian in 6 months or something. And the pay was pretty terrible. But it was amazing. It was the first kind of foot on the ladder. So it was great. Because back then, I suppose it was before podcasts, before social media. So making me sound quite old. But, that was the only way to get your foot in the door was to get a job on a magazine, whatever it be, or sweeping the floors. As long as you get in the door, then that was the main thing.
I can imagine, and talking on that as well, Ed, just how it was in the earlier days of journalism and working for magazine companies as well when it came to, deliberating these stories. I wanted to take the opportunity to ask you, just like, what are your favorite YouTube channels or podcast or content creators, just in this space generally, and also just from your perspective, how do you see the change in the way in which consumers like myself and the guys here, they kind of like take in kind of the stories and stuff like that too? Because as you mentioned, back in the day, it was magazines. I remember my dad, bringing home a magazine. I'm not going to give away the name because they don't sponsor us, unfortunately, but they had like a red backdrop and a white writing, and the name starts with A, so it should be a dead giveaway to most. But yeah, you would either sit down and read that, or also probably giving away my age too. You had teletext back in the day as well, so you'd log on to teletext and you'd get like a little inside scoop of what was happening. And we even had like, I think, Bruce Jones, a GT3 commentator, on here previously, just talking about like life in the paddock and having to like live and breathe some of the stories, before putting pen to paper and translating that, to the wider audience. So how do you see the kind of like the development and the movement away from kind of hard paper kind of magazines to now the kind of wide variety of different things such as podcast, YouTube reviews, and stuff like this too, in the way that they're perceived?
Yeah, so because I did 12 years at magazine, so 2 at Autocar Italia, and then 10 at Motorsport. So I've got a soft spot for printed kind of copy, and I've got Motorsport magazines from 1950 to present, and I've got them all up on my shelves in my office, and I love that kind of feeling of sitting down with the magazine. That said, any books I read nowadays, I read them on my phone. So I can't get too off my high horse about liking the paper copy. I think what I find interesting is I love the breadth of content you get now, and it suits so many more people. Sometimes you haven't got 20 minutes to sit down and read 3 magazine articles. Sometimes you've got kind of a couple of minutes at a bus stop, and you can still kind of consume content. The only thing I would say, I think there's a lot of noise out there now. And I find myself, scrolling through the Facebook feed, and you pause and you're like, why am I 2 minutes into watching someone like power hose their driveway? This is just, I'm not gaining anything from this. So there is a balance somewhere. And I think for me that I love video content. I love podcasts, because I did podcasts for a long time at Motorsport and then some at Goodwood. And obviously the printed version, but I always think, unless I'm learning something new, I sort of switch off a bit. So I like being informed or finding out something new, whether that's to do with motorsport or the local paper or whatever it is. But I think that's a reasonably good barometer, and it tends to stop you watching completely mindless stuff as you're kind of wasting time in the evening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely see that perspective as well there. I'll tag team my fellow friend F1BLAG into the conversation too, Blag. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And Ed, good to speak. I'm here in my own office, but I think it's about 10 degrees hotter down here from where you are. You mentioned being at Autocar Italia for a little while, and something that I've never really comprehended is the difference between motorsport in Italy versus motorsport in Britain. So as someone that sort of lived both, do you have a sense of sort of the difference between the fans and the difference between the way the media operates there and indeed the teams? The reason I ask, we look at Ferrari, and sometimes you might think, there's a bit of a, maybe I'm being rude, a clownish, quality sometimes, but it might just be me being unfair. So yeah, what are the main differences that you've perceived?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the media, every Italian is a Ferrari fan. That's obviously a very broad brush, but there's the main kind of sport newspaper, like La Gazzetta dello Sport, doesn't put any punches, and if you're Ferrari and you don't perform, the worst reaction you are going to get is from the Italian media. It's pretty full on. Whereas if Hamilton and Mercedes don't win a race or aren't performing very well, you just don't really see it in the newspapers here. I think that it all goes back to kind of people's attitude of cars and motorsport. And I find in the UK, if you can live in quite a sort of closeted environment, you can go to Goodwood and everyone loves cars and you chat cars, it's great. But wider world, there's not a huge percentage of British people who love cars. And more and more they're sort of seen as a kind of slightly dirty thing you shouldn't be driving. And whereas in Italy, they love cars, especially nice cars. And I remember I borrowed a Ferrari in London off the press office. I think it was the 458 when that first came out, and I was driving it back into London, and I stopped at some traffic lights, and it was an open top, and this van driver just leant out, swore at me, and I said, "It's not even my car," and he basically just called me a whole number of names for just driving a Ferrari. Whereas in Italy, I was very lucky. I went around the Lamborghini factory, and afterwards, the guy showed me around. Said, "Look, do you want to take a car out?" I said, "I'd love to." And there was the Aventador soft top, and he said, "Look, we've programmed a route in. Don't worry about the police. We've got an agreement with them, and just follow the route and have fun." And it was the most amazing drive up into the hills. And I remember I went into this little village, and I drove past a school, and all the kids were on break time, and every single kid ran to the fence and cheered as I drove past because they just loved Lamborghinis, and they just thought they were the coolest thing in the world. And it's almost polar opposite to the UK, when people basically, if you drive a modern supercar, you tend to get a pretty frosty reception on the road. Whereas in Italy, they love it and they're interested. They want to take photos. I remember I was in the Nissan 350Z when that first came out, and I was going down the Autostrada down to Bologna, and I got pulled over by the police. And I thought, oh God, was I speeding? And well, I basically started chatting to them, and they just wanted to know about the car because they hadn't seen one before. And eventually they said, "How fast does it go?" I said, "Well, I don't know. I've literally just started driving it." They said, "Well, let's find out. Follow us." And so I was going down the outside lane of the motorway with the police car in front of me with its lights flashing and me trying to keep up with it. And eventually, about 140 miles an hour or something, I wimped out and pulled off the motorway. But yeah, I mean, it's a different world in terms of cars. But if you're an Italian team and not performing, I wouldn't want to read the reviews in their sport paper.
Yeah, your comments on that and Ferrari remind me of, I think it was 99 at Suzuka, where Eddie Irvine could have won the first Ferrari World Drivers' Championship in 20 years, and they only brought 3 tyres out to the pit stop. And I think there were a few tyres left around Maranello by disgruntled fans. Such was their disgust.
Yeah, I know, and I think I'd be interested to see what the kind of Italian media is making of this year, because it's sort of a Ferrari at the moment. Well, I think Ferrari on and off, they are a brilliant team, but I do find as though they're kind of one of those rugby teams that just as they're about to score a try, they knock it on. And I don't know whether that was ironed out. Well, certainly that wasn't such a big thing when it was Jean Todt in control with Ross Brawn, Michael Schumacher, and that kind of trio that sort of took over Ferrari. And one of the deals I think they had was that, back to Ferrari, the company, don't get involved, don't meddle, and we'll sort this. And they had it running really well, but I don't know. I just slightly feels that they've been very unlucky with engine failures. Well, unlucky, or that their engine is a weak engine. But you just slightly feel that they're quite good at clutching defeat from the jaws of victory.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, it's not that long ago before sort of Jean Todt arrived at Ferrari, but the number of people that you sort of come across online that perhaps can remember Ferrari before the Schumacher era is limited. So I've probably come to the conclusion in the last month or two that Ferrari with Schumacher, Todt and Brawn was the anomaly, and that either side of that is probably the natural. I don't know if there is a natural culture. Maybe that's it. I mean, go on.
No, sorry. Yeah, I suppose it depends how far back you go, because if you rewind to the 50s and 60s, Ferrari was sort of all conquering until when sports cars in the 60s they were brilliant, but they have resting on their laurels in the sense that Enzo Ferrari, when he first saw the Cooper with the engine in the back, I think he came out with the phrase of, "No, the horses always draw the carriage. You don't put the horses behind the carriage." And it was kind of this quite archaic view and it was all about the engine. It's always been about the engine with Ferrari. And I mean, just ask Toyota how hard it is to win in Formula One. And so I think you saying Schumacher era was the anomaly. The facts kind of say that's exactly what it is, really. They've won a lot of championships, but not. They've lost a lot as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we'll jump around a bit, but you did bring up this season in Formula One, and of course we'll talk about many other things. But do you get the sense that the Ferrari has, on quite a few occasions, been the faster package, or is it quite tight with Red Bull?
I think it's very tight. I think Ferrari is a faster race car, or has been on a number of occasions. I would be surprised if Ferrari win the World Championship. I hate making Formula One predictions because someone will listen to this in a year's time and be saying, "What an idiot." So I try not to. But Red Bull seem to be a more efficient championship-winning machine, and Verstappen is at the sort of height of his game. Sergio Perez is doing better than Alex Albon did, or previous teammates, in the sense that he can actually work with the team because he's in the right place on the track rather than back in seventh or something. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's still too early in the season, but I would be surprised if Ferrari were neither of the championships. One of the things that amazed me is that obviously Mercedes, I think, have slightly been playing down, how bad their car was, how difficult it's been to sort. But they're there or thereabouts now. And whilst it's too little, too late, I would have thought for this year, unless Ferrari and Red Bull have an absolute shocker. It's amazing how they've managed to turn that around and kind of get back to, roughly on the leader's pace.
Yeah, I was going to say, for our 2023 listeners, who would have thought that Lewis Hamilton would come back from where he was to win the World Championship like that? What a superb turnaround.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
No, I mean, we didn't bully you into offering a prediction, so thanks for sort of
no, it's all right. I'm perfectly capable of hanging myself.
Yeah, a quick question before Denz comes back in. I mean, you talked a bit about the turnaround going on at Mercedes, and the technical side of things. You, I'm sure, see cars from every era. Do you think that the modern fan really gets how difficult it is, even if you've got a beautiful car, to set it up, let alone to develop it, like the technical side?
I think you I think you obviously get engineers and all people who are aspiring to be engineers, and they sort of have a better understanding of it. But it's a bit like me saying, oh, I understand German just because I speak a few words. Just because I understand elements of engineering does not mean I understand a Formula One car. I think a lot of journalists are quite nervous about saying, oh, no, I don't really understand all the intricacies of it, because that's basically then admitting that they don't know how to do their job. The problem is they are so complicated now, and it's all secretive. Yes, you can take photos, you can look at the flips and the curves, and if you've got an aerodynamic kind of background, you can kind of see the direction of that they're trying to go in. But the wonderful thing about the Land Speed Records car, the Bloodhound, they released everything. So it was this amazing engineering tool. And because they weren't really, they didn't really have a direct competitor. Whereas Formula One is so secretive that actually young people who want to learn about the engineering, there's a limit to what they can actually learn about a Formula One car. But they are, unbelievably complicated. So, as you say, even just getting it set up right. And then once you layer the setup with the actual the aerodynamics, how the driver works, how the tires work, then you've got the race strategy, then you've got what other cars are doing on top. So I always find it quite amusing when people say, oh, yeah, no, well, Sergio Perez drove a pretty average race. He probably didn't. If you had all the facts, you might actually find out that it was one of his best races he's ever done. So, I think Formula One is overly complicated now, especially with the hybrid engine. I'm looking forward to the fuel change they're doing in 2026, because I think that will be very interesting to see how they run on synthetic fuels and how that might flow into road cars and how we use our classic cars as well, actually, because I do think synthetic fuels are quite important for our future. But yeah, Formula One, it's so complicated. I think for the average viewer, you've just got to kind of you've got to discard a lot of the noise and just enjoy the show.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that one, Ed, and I'm gonna tag back in from Blag. And on the topic of that as well, I just wanted to get your thoughts too on we recently at the weekend saw the unveiling and kind of a teaser from Ferrari, just with a separate project that they're working on. It's a new hypercar they have for the LMH class for the prototype series of the World Endurance Championship. A kind of question we got in from the fans is just do you see Ferrari's like interest in maybe other spec series as a distraction from their main bread and butter series being F1? And on top of that as well, do you think it's kind of normal in a sense, like a trend that we're seeing these manufacturers like Ferrari and such push for kind of more sustainable and renewable forms of mobility through challenging themselves through these series?
Yeah, so I mean it's interesting you saying odds is it going to distract Ferrari from Formula One and things like that? That was one of the big bones of contention that John Surtees always had with Ferrari, was that they wouldn't just concentrate on Formula One. They, the sports car would delay the Formula One car, which would delay the sports car. And I think times are different now. Yes, I think it's obviously another ball in the air, but it's not. I doubt they're going to be pulling people off the Formula One program in order to run their new Le Mans car. Personally, I'm so excited about this new kind of era. I think you can call it a new era, and having all these manufacturers in, because whilst it's great having privateers and things like that, you need the manufacturers building cars. And one of the most exciting things is not just the number of manufacturers, it's the fact that they've got to supply customer teams at a set price, and the customer team will get the factory car or the. So, it'd be a bit like, the Porsche 956, 962 era, when if Porsche stumbled, then one of their privateer teams would still win in a Porsche 962. But I just think Le Mans is great because there's different classes, different speeds, and it's the variation that's wonderful. But, let's all be honest, despite everyone saying, oh, the LMP2 battle has been the most exciting, one to watch in previous years, to see the battle for the lead. Having two cars basically from the same manufacturer fighting it out over 24 hours is not that interesting, even if you've got a great LMP2 category, a great GT category, but AM and Pro this year, and that's obviously finishing this year. But I think the new era will be fascinating. Going on to a kind of other point, the future, or these. How did you phrase your question? Sorry, because you asked about whether or not it's going to kind of trickle into the road cars.
Yeah, because I mean, and probably what I'll do to supplement that point as well, Ed, is that we've seen quite a few adventures and experiments been run recently. Like I would like to also bring up Sebastian Vettel and him running Nigel Mansell's Red 5 Williams car at the Silverstone event too, on like bio kind of renewable fuels. And also we're seeing as well Mercedes with their kind of Project One car and other kind of bigger manufacturers trying to like build essentially street legal like race cars that have a lot of technology that will then.
Yeah, I mean, so I find the kind of these sort of supercars quite interesting in the fact that you can drive them on the road, obviously, but actually there's no point in having anything faster than the Volvo or like a BMW 320d or whatever it is, because actually on the normal roads, in order to drive a BMW 320d on the limit on a B road, you've got to be going well over the speed limit. So, the technology, even just a normal saloon nowadays with the tires, the like very clever suspension and dampers. And so I always find these kind of supercars, especially like the Mercedes, sort of quite interesting because it's such a small market. Because, how are you going to have fun with that on the road? You can drive it around and sit in traffic and have people point at you and take photos. Great. But actually to experience what that car can do, you need to be at a track. As you say, you've got a supercar with a Formula One engine in it. And I find it quite interesting because a lot of it is going down the hybrid route. There's a lot of electric supercars now. There's an electric pickup truck that was at the Festival of Speed that was unbelievably quick. And I think it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next 2 years, because I am probably in a bit of a minority in that I don't believe electric cars are the way forward at all. But please don't hate me for that. It's just a worry I have.
Well, I don't think many people would have a right to hate you for that one, Ed. And actually, I'd invite you almost to kind of explain why you don't think it's the future. Because I would be in your camp too, thinking that in some countries, in some districts, in some boroughs, the infrastructure is not quite there. But that's kind of my reasoning. Is the kind of reasoning you have for why it's not
No,
really?
so well, I mean, it's going back to the sort of the very basics of it. Fuel that you burn is a very clever way to power a car or a mobile object, because as you burn it, you get rid of the weight. Whereas with batteries, you've got the weight the whole time. So whether you've got 1% charge or 100% charge, you're still carrying around that extra weight. And batteries are very, very heavy. I know technology moves on and they will get lighter, but they're extremely heavy. There's no getting around that. Actually, what we should be doing is either using clean fuel or less fuel. And by adding weight, you're using more fuel, as it were. My second problem with batteries is that there are holes, enormous holes where people are digging for lithium, digging it out of the ground. You then basically build these batteries, but what happens to them when they're finished? No one's ever, I'm sure there might be something out there, but no one's ever been able to tell me what happens to these car batteries when they're finished. People say, oh, you can use them in your house. I've never met anyone who's used them in their house. I've met people who've got electric cars and done quite a lot of miles and had to replace the batteries. So are we just going to be dumping these into the ground, which sort of looks like it at the moment? And then I think one of the main ones is where the electricity comes from. So Volvo did a survey. Well, they did a kind of investigation into that. There's one of their cars that has, I think it's the V40 or something, that has an electric version and a fuel-powered version. And if you were to charge your electric version off totally green energy, it would still take 30,000 miles in that Volvo before it was greener or had a less of a carbon footprint than the fuel-powered version. Obviously, that would improve as more and more electric cars are built. But if you were to charge that off the UK mains at the moment and split between fossil-fueled electricity and green electricity, you'd have to do 70,000 miles in your electric car before it was greener than the fuel-powered one. So there's those, and then the final ones. It's this whole thing of getting new cars every 2 years or trading it in and upgrading, and that's the worst thing you can do, because a lot of the carbon footprint comes from building the car, and that doesn't help at all. And also, the last point is that we're just binning 100 years or more of internal combustion engine development. So the modern Formula One engines are amazingly efficient, incredibly efficient. They are, what they might be able to manage in another 20 years is almost mind-boggling. And if we can make synthetic fuels, which we already do, they're just £10 a litre. But if we can make them in bulk and get the price down, then I just see that as a much easier way to solve the problem. Electric cars, which I just don't see. I'm sure there are lots of people out there with electric cars who are disagreeing with it, and I apologise, but that is just those are my thoughts on the matter.
I think those
Like
are very
a
fair
rock
points.
going through the window.
No, Ed, I think the points you made are very reasonable, and I think they stand for a lot of things which could be improved or maybe need to be looked at much deeper. I think as well, even just for the normal consumer, like normal person that's not a petrol head like you or I, just with the cost of living crisis that's happening at the moment and the cost of electric and stuff too, it does beg the question how if they want to push this particular thing on people with electrified vehicles, that's one thing, but to make it sustainable, to make it worthwhile, to make it affordable for people is something that needs further consideration, like you said. And whilst we have the combustion engine, whilst we found ways to make it more efficient, maybe we need to be looking more at that than necessarily trying to reinvent the wheel again, as you mentioned. So I think that's a fair point. And actually, kind of to segue into another topic, Ed, because I know this is your bread and butter as well. Goodwood Festival of Speed, which again is such an incredible event, and I'd implore people to go, including myself, because I've never been. But how I'd like to kind of start this one, Ed, is what is the history behind Goodwood Festival of Speed? How did it start? And what if you're just like somebody new that was going to go there for the first time? What could you expect to see there?
Okay, well, I'll take the last kind of point first. It's the Goodwood Festival of Speed. Goodwood do 3 motorsport events through the year. One is the members meeting and the revival, and they're for historic racing cars. And then in June, July, Festival of Speed, which is the biggest motoring extravaganza you will ever see. You'll see anywhere in the world. It's the biggest greenfield build site in the world. It's on site. It produces enough electricity to power the local town, Chichester. It is enormous. A couple of 100,000 people over the 4 days. Every single person that goes there is blown away by what you see, whether that's Richard Petty or your average punter. And there's everything from modern Formula One cars all the way through to the kind of the pioneers of motorsport. The very early cars, kind of 1903, 1910, all the way through touring cars, rally cars. There's the Forest Rally stage. There's motorbikes. There's off-road arena. There's monster trucks. There's drifters. There's supercars. There's the manufacturers bring all their kind of future cars, their concepts. So it's kind of a celebration of the past, present, and future of motoring and motorsport. If that sort of okay.
I think it sums up brilliantly. Yeah, go ahead. Yep.
So Goodwood, during the Second World War, became an airfield. There was an RAF West Hampton, which is basically right by Goodwood, and owned by the Freddie Richmond, who was the Duke of Richmond's grandfather. And after the war, during the war, it got very wet, so they put in this perimeter circuit to move the planes around if it was wet. And after the war, it was Tony Gaze, I think, who said to the Duke of Richmond, do you know what? This perimeter road might make quite a good circuit. So they opened it up as a circuit, and they had their first meeting in September 1948. And then they ran loads of racing there all the way through to 1966 when it was closed, just because the circuit wasn't kind of meeting current standards and the cars were getting too quick. And 66 was that, Formula One's return to power. So they went from the 1.5 litre engines up to kind of much bigger engines. And everything was getting a bit fast. So, but they had, all the kind of big names raced there. The lap records held jointly by Jackie Stewart and Jim Clark. So they never had a World Championship Grand Prix, but they had plenty of Formula One races. And they had, I think, 1 motorcycle race in period, maybe 2. Anyway, so the current Duke of Richmond was always keen to reopen the circuit, but it was going to be very difficult with planning. So they thought to test the water and see kind of whether there was still an interest in motorsport at Goodwood, that they'd do this little hill climb in front of the house. And I think they spoke to the BARC, which is the British Automobile Racing Club, which is kind of the organising club. And they said, look, for something like this, you'll usually get 3,000 to 4,000 people. So that's what they sort of bargained on. But actually, the first Festival of Speed in 1993, I think 25,000 people turned up. But they were never too sure how many, because they actually broke the fencing down to get in. They ran out of tickets. So they were giving away like coat numbers to people. They didn't have anywhere to store all the money. So they basically took all the women's handbags who worked there and filled them with cash. And then they were then putting them in the back of a boot, which was then driven off and kind of hidden. And it's grown exponentially since then, but it's, especially in those early years, they sort of sourced kind of auto unions or lost cars that were off in Eastern Europe, and people saw them for the first ever time. And then they had Formula One, the sort of current Formula One teams turned up for the first time in 1994. And then Ferrari turned up for the first time in 1996. And it's grown to an enormous event. And if you haven't been, as you guys haven't, you've just got to go for 2 days if you can, because there's so much to see. the site is massive. You can spend an entire morning just wandering around the paddocks, not even getting to see the hill. So yeah, I love it. It's a very tiring kind of week for me, but it's great fun because it is the greatest names in the greatest cars and on the greatest bikes in motorsport, and they're all in one place for a weekend during the summer.
That's amazing, Ed. And like you said as well, it's like a huge extravaganza, and it's amazing just to see, the history and the kind of historic nature of just how it was began, how it started, the sort of cars where you could imagine being there back in its day, and then even now with the historic events that we get and the classic races that we still celebrate those things, and we're still able to mix that with all of the new kind of technology and new ideas that you see being pioneered. And actually, another question I wanted to ask you before I tag my handy F1BLAG back in was, what did you make of some of the crazy innovations that we saw take part in this year's hill climb? Because we're just watching it from home on YouTube. I saw like a really crazy Ford Transit electric super van, which in a way almost kind of reminded me of Top Gear, where Jeremy Clarkson and I know Richard Hammond and May as well would go around the Nürburgring with like what was a transit van back in 2005. But then to see a
Yeah.
fully electrified super van, I was like, this is crazy. And then I think the real kind of headline act from this year's show had to be the McMurtry Sperling as well, which for those at home thinking, what the hell is a McMurtry Sperling? Please type it up because it's one of the most craziest looking things I think I've seen in recent times. But essentially a 2 electric motor, twin fan monster that has active downforce capable of producing 2,000 kilograms of downforce, which is nuts. That's like almost Formula One levels essentially. And it smashed the time hill climb record as well, and left a lot of people just scratching their heads. And it was a really interesting year because we had like an electrified GT3 Cup car try and have a go. We had so many different participants, but yeah, could you give us some insight into some of the wacky and some of your favorite cars that were
Yes,
that took part in Hill Climb?
the super van was really cool. Romain Dumas was driving that, who used to hold the records driving the Volkswagen IDR. And so the Ford's, this is super van 4 because there were 3 before it. And basically, the previous super vans were all kind of vans with Formula One engines. And this was the 4th one, which was obviously an electric one. And it was very, very quick. But the McMurtry Sperling was amazing. And the incredible thing about that is that the fans basically suck the car onto the road so that you have 2 tons of downforce from 0 miles an hour. So it could easily just stick itself to the roof. And I did ask one of the guys on the team, I said, are you going to try it? And they said, we'll wait till we have 2 cars and then we'll try it with one of them. But yeah, I mean, Max Chilton, because I was up in the top paddock interviewing drivers and things once they come up the hill. And both Alex Summers, who drove on Saturday, who's very good hill climber, and Max Chilton, their eyes were wide, just because it's just monumentally fast. And anyone who's listening, just Google it, McMurtry Sperling Goodwood, and you'll see the run. And it's extraordinary. Whether or not you like electric cars, it is amazing. And what's quite interesting about it is that as it goes up the hill, because it's not making a huge racket, you can actually hear the crowd and kind of gasping as it goes up. And the wonderful thing about the electric cars for hill climbs is they're perfect for hill climbing. Power straight away, and you can use all your power on a 1.1 mile hill climb. So as you mentioned, the Porsche, electric Porsche, that was very quick. But it's fact they basically every year they have a shootout, and every car that's invited can run in the shootout if it wants to. So you get this amazing breadth of cars. So you've got pre-war cars, you've got touring cars, you've got Le Mans cars, you've got an Indy car, all competing to do the fastest time up the hill. But this year, as you said, the McMurtry Sperling was just amazing. It was another level. So yeah, it now holds the outright and kind of full hill record at 39.081, I think. That beat Romain Dumas at 39.9. And Nick Heidfeld held the official record for a long time when he did 41.6.
F1? I
Yeah,
think it
in
was like,
the
yeah.
MP413 in 1999. And the reason, so everyone gets quite rightly, because it's basically he set the record at 41.6 in 1999, and they then stopped Formula One cars doing timed runs because it was just getting a bit dangerous. And so that record stood for a long time. And then Romain Dumas, Loeb came to beat it in the Pikes Peak car. But part of the problem with that was that the car is obviously, the battery needs to last for Pikes Peak, which is much longer than the Goodwood Hill. And the weather wasn't perfect. So it was a little bit damp, but he still did pretty well in that. And then Romain Dumas came in the IDR and did a 39.9. But it wasn't on Sunday afternoon. And that's when the official record is set. So even though he went faster in practice, it was then wet on Sunday and he didn't beat the record. So Nick Heidfeld still held the official record, whereas Romain Dumas was the outright fastest time. Whereas now, it's nice and simple, Mercury Spearling beating everything. So all nice and easy now.
Exactly. No, it's so true. And actually, on the topic of which as well, Ed, like we've talked about some of the fastest cars that have been up the hill, but I wanted to ask you as well before I tag F1BLAG back in. What's the wackiest or like most unorthodox car you've ever seen take part in the hill climb, or just genuinely do like a demo run on the circuit or like a track?
So I've seen a dragster. That was pretty mental. I've seen someone go up with a rocket on his back, like a jet engine, like a jet engine. He's called Jetpack Man, and he flew up the hill. And then in terms of actual vehicles, the Kamaz truck, you know, the trucks they use on the Dakar.
Yeah.
Absolutely mental. I mean, it's enormous, and it was sideways, and yeah, it's that. I mean, you get some amazing things coming up, but I always quite like the weird and wonderful. And the Kamaz truck was pretty special. The Dakar, the Toyota Hilux, the Dakar car this year I thought was quite cool because it's just, you know, it doesn't really share much with the Hilux at all. It's just incredibly well engineered, and they're enormous. You don't realize when you're watching the Dakar or something like that on TV how big these cars are. They're absolutely massive. And then this year, one of the highlights was back on a motorcycle for the first time in 30 years, I think, or just about 30 years, because he had that huge crash in 1993 that left him paralyzed from the chest down. But he got back on his championship-winning motorcycle and rode up the hill with his great rival Kevin Schwantz, his mentor Kenny Roberts. Danny Pedrosa was there once, and then also Mick Doohan as well. And that was pretty special. There were sort of grown men kind of crying at the top of the hill seeing that. It was a special moment.
I feel like I'm your target market for Goodwood, and I've never been, but it's absolutely fascinating. You were talking a little bit there about sort of trucks and vans going up hills. I was remembering, I'm sure I've seen a video of Alain Prost testing a Renault Scenic or something that they were developing in the early 90s. So hopefully that's been up the hill. A really basic question for you. So how would I go about sort of booking? Like, is it just going on the Goodwood website?
Yeah. Go to the Goodwood website, and I don't think the dates or the tickets have been released yet for next year, but you can get on a ticket alert thing, so that as soon as they're released, you can buy tickets. Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, I worked there full time for 2 years, and now, you know, to help with the TV coverage. So I'm as biased as you can get. You know, if you're a motorsport fan, or even just a car fan or a bike fan, it's amazing. You've got to go and do it, because it's almost impossible to describe how big or cool an event it is. So yeah, it's just you've got to go along. So please, if we talk again at this time in a year and you haven't gone, I'll be very unimpressed.
Yeah, once Lewis Hamilton's won the World Championship, and
of course,
in 2023.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll sign up for the alert. And does it sell out? Is it kind of like the Glastonbury?
Yeah, they do. Yeah. No, they sell out every year. I think pretty much every Goodwood event, motorsport wise, the members meeting, Revival, and Festival Speed all sell out ahead of time. So, yeah, it's definitely worth just getting the tickets early, and also sorting somewhere to stay, because that's always quite tricky. But they have camping on site, and you know, there's loads of options. But yeah, you've got to go along.
Okay. I mean, I'm imagining taking some friends and maybe trying not to be stereotypically English, but slightly sort of with a less jovial tone. We saw at the Austrian Grand Prix a few weeks ago that there was some accusations of abuse and inappropriate behavior, assault, even in some cases. Could you sort of, I don't know if you've witnessed that in Formula One, or is it whether it's a growing phenomenon in motorsport more widely? It's something that I've never personally experienced, but then I'm a man, fairly tall. Hopefully tend to get away with these sorts of situations. But is it something that you've kind of observed as a motorsport follower over the years, or were you shocked to see?
Yeah, I mean, do you know what I was shocked, but not that surprised, which is awful, and just actually a pretty sad reflection on kind of where we're at. I think we are moving in the right direction, but there's just so much more work that needs to be done. It's like I'm very lucky, but I've never kind of witnessed it myself in a Formula One paddock or a motor circuit or anything like that. And I don't know whether that's because the kind of paddocks I go to now are kind of pretty diverse, and they're everyone's sort of pretty decent people. I always like to think, but yeah, you hear these stories, and yeah, I mean it's just terrible. I don't even. I've been on the receiving end of a lot of abuse on social media. On YouTube's a good one actually for abuse. And I get a lot of abuse for my accent, and it's everyone's like, oh, you're posh and da da da. So I get a lot of abuse for that, and I tend to actually just reply to each comment, and invariably that gives them like a very apologetic. But I always apply in a really friendly way. But yeah, I just think it was sad to hear about it on an actual event, because on social media, whilst it's completely wrong, it's been going on for a long time, and it will continue to go on for a long time. People get abused because people can hide behind a made-up username, or they feel as though because they're sat at their desk at home, they can kind of just write write things that you would never say to someone to their face. And social media is very, very bad at that. I've had it on a very small scale compared to others, and it just annoys you. You just feel a bit helpless because what can you do? But to have it at a live event where someone was on face was pretty shocking. I can't comment too much on it because to be fair, I don't know exactly what they said. I've seen the stories, but I don't actually know kind of what was said and to who. But it obviously happened. It just shouldn't. So hopefully they do get a ban, or some kind of justice handed down to them.
Yeah, I agree. Couldn't agree with you more, that we condemn that behaviour, and hope that particularly the Formula One paddock, which is attracting millions of new fans through Netflix and so on, is an inclusive place that everyone can feel that they can enjoy themselves. And it seems almost ridiculous that we have to kind of define that as a minimum acceptable standard. You talked a little bit there about sort of experiences online, and I started on Twitter just as a bit of a board at Christmas, because my brain's usually occupied with work, and it was about sort of 7 years ago, and I've definitely noticed a sort of change in the tone, or the frequency of people perhaps not being as pleasant. I did a lot of research for this, including going on your LinkedIn, Mr. Foster. And were you the online editor just at the end of your time at Motorsport, or were you sort of looking at that online world right at the beginning? And could you elaborate a bit on what it was like at the beginning and how it changed?
Yeah, so to be honest, I've totally forgotten I had a LinkedIn profile. So it's interesting. So I joined Motorsport in 2007, and I remember sort of taking over the website because there was no one really sort of doing it, and it wasn't really a massive thing for motorsport at the time, because obviously the print was the big thing. And I remember very distinctly having a discussion with the managing director about whether or not we should start up a Twitter account. and there was lots of umming and ahhing about it, like, well, what kind of benefit? I worry it's going to be really content hungry. You're going to have to, you can't just do one tweet and walk away from it. And I remember the conversation, and it's funny. It was a long time ago now, but you used to get people who write into the magazine, and I think motoring magazines are never short of people complaining. And there's lots of very passionate fans out there who may not agree with your take on something. And so we used to get people kind of writing in, but they were invariably kind of reasonably polite. And whilst they completely disagreed with what you were saying, they were considered reasonably polite about it. Whereas politeness, in many respects of today's society, has just gone out the window. And nowhere is more acute than that on social media. And I don't understand how people can be so rude to someone else. I genuinely find it shocking. And there was one I interviewed Jamie Chadwick last year's Festival of Speed, and we had a completely normal chat. I mean, it was only kind of 60 seconds because it was in the top paddock, and all the interviews are quite short. And you ask them what they've driven up the hill, what it was like, what they're doing this season, and obviously at the time she was in W Series, and so we chatted about that. Anyway, I was searching for a tweet ages ago, so I put in Ed Foster Goodwood, trying to find, I think it was a Daniel Ricciardo interview, because my nephew wanted to see, my young nephew wanted to see kind of me interviewing Daniel Ricciardo. But anyway, I couldn't find it. What I did find was this person who had basically, she obviously hated my interview with Jamie Chadwick, and I don't even know what the problem was, but she even included a hashtag, Ed Foster is a fucking tool. Sorry, you might have to beep that out. And I was like, that seems a little harsh, because all I did was interview her. It wasn't, it wasn't even a kind of, I just did a normal interview. So yeah, you don't get that in person. You don't get it when people write into letters, write into magazines. But it's a brave new world. It's going to have to be regulated at some point. I know the social media platforms are kind of, banning people or blocking people and things, but it's not really enough. And I know, Matt Bishop, I've had a few chats with and things, and I follow him on Twitter, and he obviously gets a lot of abuse from some people. And it's just some of the things he retweets and just says, I blocked him. Unbelievable what they write. But, this is where we're at. It needs to be regulated, because it's out of control now.
Yeah, it is out of control. There's some studies in the US about violence that compare violence to a kind of contagious disease, in that if it happens to you, or if it happens in your sort of presence, you're more likely to then perpetuate that. And maybe there's something similar there, that it's almost self-perpetuating, which doesn't fill me with hope that there's an easy solution.
No.
You talked a bit there about the top paddock and the interviews you've conducted at Goodwood. I mean, thinking back to all those interviews, are there any where you were a bit sort of starstruck, or you might have met a hero, or any that were particularly memorable for you?
I mean, do you know what? There's been so many memorable ones. To put it into perspective, so this year alone, in the 4 days, I did 209 interviews. So I've probably done, in the top paddock at Goodwood, I've probably done over 1,000 interviews. And none of them have been disasters. Actually, this year there was a bit of a disaster. There was a drift driver. I can't remember his name. Hang on, I've got it here somewhere. And he was this Japanese guy, and he was just hilarious, because he was so committed in his drift car. And you know how people tend to work up to a level when they're racing? He basically leapt beyond the level and then worked his way back towards it over the weekend. And one of the drift drivers has said to me earlier in the weekend, is like, look, Ed, I wouldn't interview him, because he literally speaks no English at all. Anyway, so his first run up the hill, he hits every single barrel. He hits straw bales. It all goes completely wrong. Though he did it very dramatically and excitingly, but it all went wrong. So Hibino, yeah, that's it. And in my ear, the director says, Ed, can you make sure you get get an interview with Hibino? so I replied saying, look, do you mind if we do it as a pre-record? Because I don't think he speaks any English at all. And the director said, oh, he doesn't speak any English. Perfect. We'll do it live. So he then throws to me live, and I have to walk up to this guy knowing he doesn't speak, to then do an interview with him. And I think the interview might be online somewhere. It's excruciatingly embarrassing. But yeah, I mean, highlights Wayne Rainey. It's quite fun to interview Gordon Ramsay. He was quite amusing. I don't know. It's funny. I don't tend to get starstruck. We're all human. Some people have achieved success in some areas, and what some of these guys have managed is absolutely incredible. But at the end of the day, everyone wakes up and goes to bed at night. Everyone goes to the loo. Everyone eats. We're more similar than we are different. So, but Nigel Mansell was always pretty special, especially sat in his FW14B. That was very cool. I mean, there's been loads over the years, but it tends to be the kind of, not so much the person, but the moment. And I think it was last year, or maybe in the year before COVID, when Jackie Stewart came up the hill with his two sons behind him and Dario Franchitti, and he stopped on the hill and got his wife Helen, who's in a wheelchair, she's got dementia, and she came over as they're all sat on the hill with the engines ticking over, and he gave her a rose that he had obviously had in the cockpit with him on the way up the hill. And that was everyone was just kind of blown away by the kind of the touching moment, and interviewing him at the top of the hill after that was very special. So yeah, it's more moments than people, I think.
And I was laughing there earlier in your remarks, because when I was looking at sort of your YouTube and your Twitter, that interview with the guy that doesn't speak English was there, and I think you're sort of saying, you had to pour water on your engine,
Yeah.
Of course,
I think
there's no way that he can comprehend what you're asking.
I know, and I knew exactly why he was pouring water on his radiators, as did everyone else. But it was the one thing I could think of that had an action to it, that might give some kind of idea as to what I was talking about. And yeah, it was just I mean, it was a bit of a disaster, but it made good TV, so it was all fine. Yeah, I don't mind making a fool of myself, but that was particularly bad. I got royally set up on that one.
But actually, when you were talking about this guy hitting all the barrels on the way up, and typically people try to kind of get edged towards the limit rather than surpassing it and coming back. It reminds me that you do a bit of driving yourself. Is that right? I think you've got at least one classic car.
Yeah. So I race an FIA Works MGB, and I'm racing out in the Revival this year, so that'll be good. I think it was Denz in the intro was the quote from Graham Hill about how he's an artist, and he the circuit is his canvas and his car is the paintbrush. I would say my level of racing is more kind of paint cannon, and it's there's not a lot of artistic flair to it, but I love it. It's great fun. It's expensive, there's no way around it. The MGB is supposed to be a, relatively speaking, cheap car to race, but it's just that the prices are ridiculous. You're spending 250 quid a tire, and you'll get through a set of tires in a weekend if you do a test day. So I only really do a couple of races a year, because that's, it's just so expensive. But I do love it. And it's, it's great. It's great fun. So hopefully it all goes well at the Revival, because I've raced at members meeting and raced at Speed Week, but I've never raced at Revival. So to race at the Revival is kind of a dream come true. So hopefully the car holds together, because that would just be a shocker. Breakdown in practice, disaster.
Gosh, that's just even my maths will extend to knowing how much a whole set of tires would cost there. That's it's incredible. But hopefully they give you a lot of grip. You were sort of
no, they don't. There's none. No? There's absolutely none. But that's actually, having no grip is good, because you basically they're called Dunlop Historic, so you're always drifting. it's about kind of drifting to the right level. Because if you get completely sideways on the apex, or heaven forbid on corner exit, you lose so much time down the next straight. But in order to carry the speed through the corner, you've got to be going sideways, and that's the kind of the joy of it. So basically the tires don't grip, they don't last, and they're really expensive. So they've nailed everything.
But it's addictive enough that you keep going back to the tire dealership and restart.
Well, no, you have to run Dunlop Historics, so you can't run any other tire. Yeah. So you're stuck with it. I personally would like to see us change to Avons because they last better. But the historic racing all runs on these historic Dunlops. And Dunlop says that it loses money on every tire it makes for the historics. I find that hard to believe, but I may well be wrong. But it's one of the most crippling costs of the tires because you just get through them. You know, heaven forbid if you run a Cobra, you're going to be through them even quicker.
You were talking a little bit earlier about, you know, it needing to be a Sunday to actually count your hill climb against the record. And it did make me think, you talking about these tires as well. Does someone have to run engineering, and are there technical and sporting regs at Goodwood?
Yeah, so cars basically have to be kind of original. You know, you can't. I think it'd be a bit frowned upon to turn up with a sort of a Group C car that's also got nitrous. It's not going to happen. But I think there are obviously reasonable regulations. I don't know. That's done by the scrutineers and things. But the main thing is that all the cars are safe, and and I'm sure there'll be specific tires that specific cars can use, so that you don't go off and just get really sticky tires for a pre-war car, because it just doesn't, it wouldn't make sense and everything would break on it. But so I have to say I don't know the ins and outs of the regs, but there will definitely be some.
Well, I hear Michael Massey's looking for a job, so if there are any vacancies.
Perfect. Yeah, that'd be great. What a disaster that was.
Yeah, I mean, we could go on about that one all day, and I'm sure our listeners have heard about that. I mean, were you watching that Grand Prix live when it was happening, or was it more the aftermath?
I was. Yeah. I think Max Verstappen is a very worthy champion. He won more races. He drove brilliantly. There were moments of it not quite going right. But I do think Lewis Hamilton was robbed of a championship there. And how he will ever get over that, I don't know. Because I think if he wins another championship, not all will be forgiven. But it's the fact that it was his 8th world championship to make him, without doubt, the most successful Formula One driver of all time. And to have that kind of taken away in that manner, I thought was particularly unfair, because it was just the way it worked, and the only 5 cars being let through, and the strategy that Max was on with his new tyres, the time in the race, Hamilton's old tyres, it couldn't have worked worse for Hamilton or any better for Verstappen. So it did feel like a very cruel way to lose it. But as I said, Verstappen's a worthy. And I think he'll probably go on to win his 2nd championship this year. But not a great day in the office for Michael Massey, that one.
It was a human error, so I hear, according to the FIA report.
Do you know what? I have to say, hats off to them for saying human error, because we run a cafe up here in Scotland, and I had to do a health and safety document for it. And basically what you do is you nick one offline, and you then change it so it suits your business. So the one I downloaded, it said there is no such thing as an accident. And I just thought, oh my God, what kind of world are we living in? And actually, no one will admit a mistake now. And it's one of the most infuriating things I come across in my life. And I'm always, if I make a mistake, I'm the first to put my hand up and say, I'm so sorry, I made a mistake. And people do. The fact that Michael Massey made the deciding race of the FIA 2021 Formula One World Championship, not a great one. Would have been better if he made the mistake at like Super Stocks at Cowdenbeath or something in Scotland. But yes, it's I like it when people say, do you know what? It was human error. We made a mistake. I quite like that because no one ever says it anymore. Everyone's always pointing the fingers like, oh, well, it was this system or that system or, yeah. Anyway, rant over. Sorry.
Yeah. I think that's fair enough. There were no accidents. Okay, well, we'll talk to the Scottish. I don't know what the organisation would be, but some sort of food
the kind, there'll be. I can't remember what the health and safety document was off now, but it just blew my mind. It absolutely blew my mind. That someone could say there's no such thing as an accident. The thing is, nowadays you're not allowed to trip over. The reason why you tripped over is because there was a little bit of pavement that wasn't 100% perfect. And that's mentality I find very frustrating. But anyway,
let me ask you two quick fire motorsport questions, and then we'll take the interview in a slightly different turn. But before we do, you obviously follow historic cars. You've clearly got a real passion for it. Could you what's your favorite car? It's probably impossible to list, but if you picked one, and maybe a road car and one in terms of Formula One, do you have a favorite era, favorite design, favorite manufacturer?
Yes. Do you know what? This my brother and I raced with each other once a year, and he comes and races the MGB with me, and invariably we end up playing the game of, right, you're allowed 3 road cars, 3 race cars, or you're allowed 1 road car, 1 race car. And so this just reminds me of that game. I tend to think about things I'd like to use or I could use. So I'm not really that interested in a modern Formula One car, in the sense that I won't fit in it. I can't drive it. I can't race it. It's too expensive to run. It's an amazing piece of engineering, incredibly fast, but actually for me, it doesn't hold a huge amount of interest. I love 60s sports cars. They're just some of the most beautiful bits of machinery in the world. I love the Group C cars. They just look like racing cars. They look how like racing cars should. And then road car wise, again, I'm just keen on the historics. I find I don't really have much interest in owning a modern supercar. I've actually, that said, I've got a first generation Audi R8. And because it was the first supercar I ever drove when I was working at Motorsport magazine. I can't remember where I went in it, but anyway, it was the first kind of supercar I drove. And I remember thinking at the time, I love this, but the sad thing is I'll never ever be able to afford one. And actually, the first rates have gone down in value so much that I bought one 2 years ago that was cheaper than a Golf, and it's only on 30,000 miles. And my thinking is that if I hold on to it for 10 years, I should be able to use an R8 for free. And it's not kind of modern day supercar quick. It's it's sprightly, but you can drive it like a normal road car, so it's really cool. But favorite road car, can I go for quite a niche one? Is that okay?
Go for it.
Yeah. Okay. So Jaguar built, I think it was 13 lightweight Jaguar E-types for racing. And they're worth, huge amounts of money now. What's lesser known, built an extra one for a guy called Sir Henry Ropner. And he called up the factory and said, I want one of those lightweight racing cars, but as a road car. And so they built this road car to factory lightweight specification. And he bought it off someone who had no idea what it was. He basically swapped it for his road going V12 E-type, and this Ropner car was in bits. Well, I remember my mum saying she was particularly cross because he drove off in a beautiful road going V12 E-type and came back with a trailer full of bits. Anyway, he had that for 30 years or something, and it was just the most amazing car. It was quick, it looked beautiful, and to me, and we had to sell it, to pay for things on the farm back in, I think, 2011. And I think Sir Anthony Bamford now owns it, of JCB. And I did email him a while ago saying, if you ever want to sell it, I'd love to buy it back. Not that I'll ever be able to afford it, but that I think is the kind of perfect road car, because it was the business. And then kind of perfect race car. The problem is because I race, I want something I can actually afford to race. So that I'd say, MGB. I love my racing MGB because it is reasonably affordable. I can do it. Whereas if I bought a 1970s Formula One car, or heaven forbid a 1990s one or a 2005, machine, I just simply couldn't afford to run it. So it'd be rather sad.
Yeah, you see those teams of mechanics that follow around, some of the F1 cars, like the old Lotuses or whatever. You'd have to hire an entourage, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, the V10 era is the worst because that was the sort of height of manufacturer spending. So manufacturers are turning up with lorries full of engines, and they just put new engines in all the time. So if you own a V10 era Formula One car, you need a team of people to run the engine, let alone the car, which doesn't sound like much fun. I think Christmas would be cancelled if you had to run a V10 Formula One car.
It makes £2.50. It makes £250 a tyre sound pretty reasonable.
Yes, well, exactly. Yeah, I rest my shaky case.
let me ask you one more motorsport question, and then you almost spoiled the question after that. So the question is, you sort of, in a very British way, self-deprecatingly, sort of didn't compare yourself to a particular artist, but thinking about your driving style, is there a famous driver that you happen to emulate, that you have a style that's quite similar to?
No, I have to say I don't emulate anyone who's any good. I think I'm sort of reasonably quick in the MGB. I'm not kind of, oh my god, quick at all. There's people that are out there much quicker than me. But I suppose it's quite dramatic, my driving style, because I tend to basically throw it in and see what happens, which invariably doesn't end with a perfect result. But I much prefer kind of sliding around and having a good time. I think what I'm trying to say is I'm not very precise, and my throttle application is quite binary. But I definitely wouldn't compare myself to anyone.
Not quite as smooth as Jensen Button, but you do your best.
I mean, very similar, but just not quite as smooth. Yeah, very similar to Alain Prost. I mean, actually, in fact, at Goodwood, Alain Prost came up to me and said, "Oh, Edouard, I'm not going to do an Alain Prost impression." Anyway, so yeah, there we go.
That's for the after show when you do.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Let me ask you one final question, and in so doing, I'll hand over to Denz. And that's in one of your previous answers, you referred to the farm. And when I looked at your on your Twitter, before it even said anything about motorsport, it said farming. So can you tell us a little bit about your connection to that?
Yeah, so my mum and dad moved to Fife in the 70s, Fife up in Scotland, and my father was a farmer all his life, and yes, I basically, when I left Goodwood because my dad had Parkinson's with Lewy body dementia, and I basically needed to be up here helping to run the farm and the various other businesses, the clay shooting ground, cafe, event space, livery stables, gym, and they just kind of needed attention. So that's why I then left and do the freelancing nowadays. So I would say my time is basically 80% farm and 20% freelance kind of TV writing, that kind of stuff. So so the farm, it's an arable farm. So we farm barley, wheat, oilseed rape, oats for the first time this year. And then we let out land for potatoes, carrots, and some fruit. And so we've started harvest now. So we've done the barley and cut all that. And I'm just trying to put the last load. So when I finish this, I'm going back out to the dryer and I'm trying to get the last load of barley into the dryer. So it then basically dries it down. Getting quite geeky here, but about 13% moisture content. And then that goes into the shed. Some of it's sold already, so that'll be taken away on lorries, and then others will sit on for a bit and sell kind of as and when the price is good. And then we'll be starting the oats, and then the oilseed rape, and then a lot of wheat. So we do about 1,500 tons of wheat a year. So it's kind of all hands to the pump until I would say end of August, beginning of September, depending on how we get on. So yeah, it's a busy time at the moment.
I'll tag over to my friend Denz, and as I do, I mean, motorsport and farming, the only other association I can make is Jeremy Clarkson.
So interesting. So funny you should mention. I've never met the guy. But we both used to be motoring journalists who then ended up farming. We're both divorced, and we're now going out with Irish people called Lisa. I mean, it's extraordinary. And we both tried to diversify the farm with a farm shop / cafe. But I'd love to meet him because actually we've both been doing the same thing, just at opposite ends of the country.
Yeah, well, I mean, as long as you weren't copying him like for like and potentially coming to a sticky end with one of your employers. Other than that,
yeah, I'm not. I'd like to say that all the things I mentioned, those are all the similarities. Let's just make that very clear. I don't have his sort of his shape status. I'm trying to think of a good way to put it quite yet. It may well come in the next 20 years, but yeah, that's where all the similarities finish.
Thank you for that, Ed. And also, thank you, Blag, as well. Yeah, I'm going to come into this round to show off, essentially. But we got one, we call it like the fantasy kind of segment, Ed. So please bear with us for this. But one of our fans have asked us, they've given a hypothetical situation, and they wanted to see what your response would be to it. So that hypothetical situation is that Andretti Autosport get granted an entry into Formula One in 2023, for example. And they put you as the team principal. And the question is, essentially, who would you pick as the two drivers to star in the team? As you've come across and interviewed many drivers as part of your role on the Goodwood Festival of Speed kind of a TV aspect of things.
Yeah.
But also, which brands would you pick as the sponsors for Andretti Autosport as well, being the team principal?
Okay, so I'm a firm believer in actually. Basically, you want a driver to be very fast. They've got to be rounded, but I don't really necessarily want someone who's good at PR or anything like that. They just need to be. So really, in terms of kind of the current drivers, in that sort of top level, you've got Hamilton, you've got Verstappen, you've got Leclerc, you've got, I think George Russell is knocking on the door as well. To, going by what people say about him. So it has to be one of those four or two of those four, depending on. Are you putting a budget on this, by the way, or can I just throw as much money as I want at it?
Money is no object here, Ed. And also, I was going to say as well is they don't even necessarily have to be an F1 driver on the current grid. They could be any driver from any period of time in any discipline of racing as well.
Oh wow! So not even like they don't even have to be alive.
No, that's correct as well. Yeah.
Oh right, okay. He'd have to go for Sterling Moss. I think he is arguably the greatest racing driver that ever lived. What in Emilia was extraordinary. So that would be one. And then a slightly lesser known one, I would go Stefan Beloff, just because he's not a lot of people kind of know about Stefan Beloff, but he was unbelievably quick, and he was killed when he was quite young. But he was known to sort of always push the envelope. And he was a very good sports car racer. And every driver that I've talked to has always said he was just amazingly fast. So I'd love to see what he could do in a Formula One car. Sponsors, Andretti Autosport. Do you know what? I do. Well, you don't really get to kind of request your sponsors, do you? I think you'd end up having to take whoever you could get, but it'd be nice to have something that wasn't too serious. Those Top Gear ones when they had Peniston oils and things like that. I'm not thinking that much of a joke. I tell you what, 7-Up would be a great one, just because you could go back to that Jordan livery, the 7-Up livery.
Yeah, Michael Schumacher debut as well.
Just stunning car, really cool livery. Martini, always a winner, but it didn't look that good on the Williams when they had it a couple of years ago. What else? It's the Canon, the Williams livery. Cool. My problem with the liveries is that they only look cool 20 years later, and actually at the time you don't appreciate a really good livery. Certainly I don't. I always think you look back and think liveries were perhaps better than you thought at the time. But yeah, I think 7-Up. I'd go. Yeah, that.
Yeah, I agree with you. And talking on the 7 Up kind of sponsorship as well, like it's been so legendary in terms of like the Eddie Jordan car. I think Sky Sports did like a feature with Mick Schumacher a couple of months ago around Silverstone where he drove like Michael's car, and just to see this how that car is, and this livery hasn't aged at all. This goes to show, like you said, that some liveries they really stand the test of time and they just become really iconic in terms of folklore or story. And there's been some amazing ones you mentioned as well, like the Martini livery, or even just like the black and gold Lotus liveries of
Yeah.
the day. There's so many interesting ones. And on that note, Ed, it's been amazing to have you on the show. We really need to get you back again, hopefully before the next Goodwood, or perhaps towards maybe the end of the year when we can do like a review of all the different series and F1 and just generally what's going on at the time as well. But just for those at home, where can they find you? And have you got any interesting or any new projects that you haven't announced quite yet, or you're going to be working on in the future that we can look forward to?
No, well, so next up is the Silverstone Classic at the end, near the end of August. So I'll be working at the Revival, racing at Revival, and then so we've got a fair bit of written work. So that's the kind of next motorsport things on the list. I've got no books to plug, got no TV series to plug. But I would say to anyone who hasn't been to Goodwood, if at the very least, like watch some of the past kind of clips of it and things like that to get an idea of what it is. But do try and get tickets because it is an amazing event. It's worth going to see.
Absolutely, Ed. And on top of that, they can find you as well on Twitter at another Ed Foster, which I think is amazing as well. Because when I think of Ed Foster, you're the first person that comes to mind. So yeah,
There's many
great
more.
username there.
There's many more. Yeah.
Well, you're the original, so we're gonna keep you
Yeah.
on the top of the pinnacle there. And our final question has actually come in from our kind of leader, being Georgina. We touched earlier on your time when you were in Milan and you're doing work for Autocar too. So you're quite familiar with the Tifosi and this pesky Italians. Georgina's question to round the show up was: pineapple on pizza, yay or nay?
Absolute nay. No, can't have that. It should be banned. It's a no, a massive no.
Oh, well, Ed, honestly, it's been such a pleasure to have your time as well, and being able to chat with you and get insight, into such niche things as well. Because I think for Goodwood, people need to appreciate that is such an iconic landmark show. And it's here every single year as well. So even if you missed out on it, or you look at some of the YouTube footage and you're like, I wish I could be there. There's no excuse for not going next year, as you mentioned. So we implore everybody listening to try and check it out if you're in the UK, and if you can make it down, please do. And then Ed, any final words before we wrap up the show?
No, just thank you to you guys for having me on. I'm not very good at sort of talking about myself because I'm always asking the questions. So I hope it wasn't too boring.
No, Ed, it was absolutely fascinating, and then actually, I think we'll need a update on your farm as well as the year progresses too, just to see how things are going and maybe how the budget is for those tires.
Yeah. Well, the budget is never really there, but you spend it anyway.
That's the best logic to go by, Ed, honestly. Oh, well, thank you so much. And to everybody at home as well, tuning into this legendary episode of Stripping the Dipping, whilst Georgina's dog emphatically barks in the background. It's been AMG Denz and F1BLAG as well, another legend. We hope that you enjoy it. Make sure, of course, you follow Ed Foster as well on Twitter and all social media platforms too. And as always, huge love and support, and thanks to all of you guys tuning in. And until next time, peace.